Maya Gavanen Melanin Amenek Swilaid. My name is Rainbow Dave, and welcome to this fourth video in our Lords of Beleriand First Age Middle-earth History series. So in the last three videos, we looked at the complex relationship between the Noldorin exiles and the Sindar natives, as well as all the subdivisions within the Noldor themselves, and especially we looked at how the Dark Lord Morgoth used these divisions to his advantage. But as of the Dagor Aglareb, that's the glorious battle, the third great battle of Beleriand, Morgoth pretty much overplayed his hand, and he screwed himself over. So for the duration of this video, the Dark Lord will be locked away within his own iron prison of Angband. And for the first time in ages really, the elves are more or less free of his influence. Now I say more or less, we'll see in just a few minutes that they aren't totally free of him, but for the first time since their exile, the Noldor are now able to put their efforts into something beyond just surviving the Dark Lord's onslaught. And so in this video, we'll take a look at some of the great new realms and cities and principalities that are established by the Noldor in Beleriand. And some of these places are going to go on to be incredibly important to the story moving forward. So let's begin with the map. This is Beleriand. This is where all the action of the First Age takes place. You'll notice there are no Misty Mountains, there's no Mirkwood, there's no Mordor, there's not really anything from The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, because as I've explained in an earlier video, Beleriand is a great region to the northwest of the lands that we're familiar with in the Third Age. And at this time in the story, the Lord of the Rings part of Middle-earth is only really populated by small communities of wood elves and some larger communities of dwarves, I'll talk more about them in the next video, and also a few wandering bands of men, who will also feature in their own video coming soon. But for now, all the great cities, all the important places, with the sole exception of Khazad-dûm, they are to be found here, in Beleriand. However, the second thing that you may notice is that Angband, Morgoth's fortress, a place I've mentioned quite a few times already, is not actually on this map, and that is a testament to how much of a perfectionist Professor Tolkien and his son Christopher were when it came to building a living legendarium. So, in the published Silmarillion, we're told that the gates of Morgoth were but 150 leagues distant from the bridge of Menegroth, which is about 450 miles. However, it's unclear from this text whether that's 150 leagues as the crow flies or as the wolf runs. And so, in order to avoid a potentially erroneous map that may very well upset some die-hard cartographers, Christopher Tolkien wrote, in the History of Middle-earth, I discreetly omitted all indication of the Thangorodrim from the map drawn for the published Silmarillion. So there you go. But if you're curious, the gates of Angband lie somewhere just to the north of Ardgalan, right here. Don't worry about that word Anfauglith, I'm not going to tell you what that means just yet if you don't already know, it's a bit of a spoiler. But what Ardgalan means is the Green Plain. And Ardgalan is basically just this great grassy meadow in front of Angband, where we're actually told that during the siege of Angband, green things grew even among the pits and broken rocks before the doors of hell, which I think is just a really awesome visual metaphor. Anyway, the main Noldorin settlements that we've seen so far are all up in the north. Fingolfin and his people settled in Mithrin, right here in the northwest, and the two eldest sons of Feanor, that's Maedhros and Maglor, they settled in the northeast, around the hill of Himring. Their other brothers settled a little further south, but during these years of peace, the Noldor of the north have a good opportunity to expand their kingdoms and to occupy new domains and fiefdoms under the rule of their High King. And one of the big ones is this area in the west, Dor Lomyn. So while King Fingolfin ruled from Mithrin, his eldest son Fingon ruled in Dor Lomyn. And I'll be honest, alright, Dor Lomyn isn't exactly the nicest elven realm in Beleriand, which is not to cast any aspersions on Fingon, it's cold and it's relatively barren, much like the rest of North Beleriand, but it is the site of quite an important conflict. You see, nearly 100 years after the Dagor Aglareb, Morgoth endeavoured to take Fingolfin unawares. And so he sent a host of orcs on quite a strange route out of Angband. Instead of just flooding out the gates, which of course they now can't do because of the siege, the orcs are sent up into the White North, where they turn west and then eventually south, entering Fingolfin's lands and finally arriving here at the Firth of Dengrist. Anyway, despite the element of surprise, Morgoth's orcs do not have a good time of it. And that's because of the Prince of Dolomin, Fingon the Valiant, Fingon the Awesome. So Fingon falls upon these orcs and he drives them into the sea, winning the battle before Fingolfin even has time to get there. Although I should point out that this skirmish is not reckoned among one of the great battles of Beleriand, it's not the dagger or anything, and that's because it just really wasn't that big of a deal for the elves. But there is one blink and you miss it sentence that I do really want to talk about, as it always strikes me as just being really horrible. So while referring to Morgoth, Tolkien tells us that desiring above all to sow fear and disunion among the Eldar, he commanded the orcs to take alive any of them that they could and bring them bound to Angband. And some he so daunted by the terror of his eyes that they needed no chains more, but walked ever in fear of him, doing his will wherever they might be. And so, this implies, right, that although Morgoth may be unable to physically conquer the land due to the siege of Angband, he still has this ability and desire to psychologically or ideologically or even spiritually dominate captive elves to such an extent that they become utterly, for want of a better word, broken, even to the point that they no longer need chains to keep them prisoner. And some of these thralls he even sets free, at least in body. I mean, he knows full well that they'll never be mentally free of him, and they'll go, almost certainly unintentionally, spreading his evil will. It's an awful but really intriguing little detail that reminds us just how cruel and hateful Morgoth truly is. Anyway, that's all pretty depressing, but just before we move away from the House of Fingolfin, there's one more character and one more realm to talk about here. So Fingon's younger brother, Fingolfin's second son, is a dude called Turgon. And Turgon is both an incredibly important character in the grand scheme of things, and also not really that important right now. And I'll circle back to Turgon at the end of this video and explain exactly what it is that makes him so special. But for now, I'll just point you to this city, right on the western shore of Beleriand, Vinyamar. Now, 2 fun facts about Vinyamar. Firstly, this is one of the few places in Beleriand that is never visited by the servants of Morgoth. And also, Vinyamar was the first recorded Noldorin city to be built of stone in all of Middle-earth. Now, we will see Vinyamar again in one of the later stories of the First Age, but when we do, it'll be completely empty. An elven city right on the coast with no one living there. Mysterious. Anyway, that's enough about the House of Fingolfin for now, because a great deal of the other Noldorin realms in Beleriand revolve around the sons of Finarfin. So, towards the end of the last video, I briefly mentioned the highland forest of Dorthonion, the one that's ruled by the brothers of Galadriel, Finrod, Angrod, and Aegnor. And I guess there are 2 significant things to say about Dorthonion. Firstly, in The Lord of the Rings, we are told by Treebeard that back in the day, he used to climb in winter through the pine trees of Dorthonion. So, although it's never mentioned in the Silmarillion, we can perhaps speculate that there may have been some Ents living here in the First Age. Maybe even Treebeard. The second significant thing to say is that Dorthonion is a gate unto Doriath, and effectively thus the rest of Beleriand. So basically, as long as Dorthonion remains in Elven hands, the south of Beleriand, including Thingol's kingdom, are pretty much safe from like a full-on invasion by Morgoth. Strategically speaking, Dorthonion is a very important place. And talking of strategy, the sons of Finarfin hold another very strategic spot right here on the island of Tol Sirion. Now, Tol Sirion very simply means island in the Sirion. Tol means island, and the Sirion is the main river in Beleriand. But as you can see from the map, this river is one of the only routes from the very north of Beleriand into the south. And so, if Morgoth were ever to use it, the results would be devastating. And for that reason, Finrod, the eldest son of Finarfin, decides to build a great watchtower on this island to prevent the servants of Morgoth from ever using the river to their advantage. The tower is called the Tower of the Guard, which, if we translate into Sindarin, becomes Minas Tirith, a name I'm sure you're all familiar with. And although it definitely does go without saying, I'll say it anyway, this isn't that Minas Tirith. Obviously, Gondor will not exist for thousands and thousands of years. This Minas Tirith is just an elven watchtower on an island in a river that was built by Finrod but kept by his younger brother, / maybe nephew, depending on which version you consider canon, and his name is Orodreth. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on Dorthonion and Minas Tirith. There are other much more important elven realms to talk about, and one more in particular that's built by Finrod. But before I move on to that, I want to take a bit of a tangent to talk about the sister of the sons of Finarfin, Galadriel. Because if you recall from my earliest videos on Feanor, a huge part of Galadriel's motive for journeying to Middle-earth in the first place was her ambition to build and rule a realm of her own. So, what's really fascinating here is that throughout all of the First Age, and the Second Age too, Galadriel is the ruler of nothing. She's an honoured guest in the realms of other great rulers, but it's not until the Third Age that she becomes the ruler of Lothlorien, and even then, it's only after the last king of Lorien dies without an heir that she becomes the Lady of the Golden Wood. Not the Queen, just the Lady. Now, I've already made a character study video all about Galadriel's life, I'll put a link to it below, but the basics we need to know right now are that throughout her time in Beleriand, Galadriel tempers that ambition she once had with a huge amount of wisdom and humility. And she spends most of the First Age as a guest in Doriath. Now, just before I continue, I didn't say it in that Galadriel video, I probably should have, I'll say it now. Galadriel and Celeborn have two of the most inconsistent histories in the entire Legendarium. So talking about their lives as if there is only one canonical account given is a little bit misleading. As I've mentioned before, the first drafts of what ended up becoming the Silmarillion go back as far as 1914. But Galadriel and Celeborn did not enter Tolkien's mind until he was writing The Lord of the Rings in the 1950s. So, although Galadriel totally does feature in the published Silmarillion, as well as in the unfinished tales, she wasn't there from the beginning. And so you'll see there are quite a few different accounts of what her and Celeborn were getting up to before The Lord of the Rings, and some of them are a little bit contradictory. However, my advice, if you're ever in doubt about canon, is to trust the completed works over the incompleted works and the later writings over the earlier ones. So with that said, in the published Silmarillion, which was released in 1977, we're told that Galadriel spent most of her time in the First Age as a guest of her great-uncle Thingol in his kingdom of Doriath. And it's in Doriath that Galadriel grows into the absolute badass we all recognise from The Lord of the Rings. And there are two very important people in Doriath that Galadriel meets, and they both go on to have a profound impact on the rest of her life. First up is Mellyn the Maya, the wife of her great-uncle Eleuthingol. And Mellyn really is the mentor who turns Galadriel into the semi-divine woodland ruler that she later becomes. In fact, one could argue that Mellyn is the OG Galadriel, except even more powerful. And there are lots of things that I could talk about here, but one of the most interesting, I think, is the origins of Lembas, the elven waybread given to the Fellowship when they leave Lothlorien. So, the first Lembas recipe was created by the Valar queen, Yavanna. She's effectively the goddess of plants and nature and growing things. And as far as we know, Yavanna only taught this recipe to one other individual, her star pupil, Mellyn. Now, Mellyn is the one who brought this recipe to Middle-earth, and it's at this time in Doriath that she taught the recipe to Galadriel. So in the entire Legendarium, there's only 3 individuals that we know of who make lembas. They are all great women, and they all give it once as a gift. One's a goddess, one's an angel, and one's Galadriel. So hopefully this will give you an idea of just how significant it is that Galadriel gives lembas to the Fellowship. It's not just a snack, it's a divine gift from the Elder Days. Anyway, the other all-important person who Galadriel meets in Doriath is none other than her future husband, Celeborn. Now, as I've said before, Celeborn is also a character with a lot of different origin stories, but the one we're given in the Silmarillion is that he is a Sindarin prince, and actually, just like Galadriel, he is a kinsman of Eleuthingol. So Celeborn's father was a guy called Galadriel, and his father was an elf called, of all things, Elmo. And Elmo was the youngest brother of Eleuthingol and Olwe. Now, this does technically mean that Galadriel and Celeborn are second cousins, as their grandfathers were brothers, but to be fair, it's implied that Thingol, Elmo, and Olwe are among some of the first generations of elves ever to exist, so I wouldn't worry too much about the size of their gene pool. And according to the most straightforward iteration of his history, we're told that Celeborn has been living in Doriath since the Ages of Starlight, which means that by the time of the Lord of the Rings, Celeborn is possibly among the top 3 oldest elves still living in Middle-earth. Anyway, Tolkien doesn't give us many details on Galadriel and Celeborn's romance, but he does say that there was great love between them, and therefore she remained in the Hidden Kingdom with Mellyn, and of her learned great lore and wisdom concerning Middle-earth. So keep that in your mind throughout a great deal of the drama and the strife that makes up the First Age. Galadriel is just kinda chilling with her husband and her mentor, slowly growing ever wiser and steadily learning those skills and that knowledge that we'll see so much of 7,000 years later in The Lord of the Rings. And so with that, I'm going to segue away from Galadriel and Celeborn for a good while, and I'll return our focus to her super awesome older brother, Finrod. Because although I've already mentioned Dorthonion and Minas Tirith, both of which Finrod had a role in establishing, they are not the realms for which he is best remembered, nor are they the realms that he rules in person. The realm that Finrod rules and eventually becomes lord of is a region called Nargothrond, and Nargothrond is a fascinating place. But to tell the story of its founding, we need to start at the very beginning. So, in the 50th year of the First Age, Finrod was hanging out with his brother/nephew Orodreth on the island of Tol Sirion, and here he was visited by his beloved cousin, Turgon, the second son of Fingolfin. And we're told that Finrod and Turgon left Orodreth and they set off together southward. And the two of them basically just went for a lovely walk along the river. I mean, Finrod and Turgon are two of the wisest and loveliest characters in all of fiction, so I imagine this was a really nice walk. Anyway, when night fell, the two cousins rested upon the riverbanks beneath the summer stars, and this is where we see the return of one of the most powerful beings in the entire Legendarium. So, it's been quite a while since I last talked about any of the Valar taking an active role in the story. If you recall, after the rebellion of the Noldor, Manwë, the king of all the Valar, he decreed that the exiled elves were basically on their own, and no Valar or Maiar should aid or hinder them in their flight. And so, after creating the sun and the moon, the Valar do, for the most part, leave the story. But there is one exception. I think I said in maybe even my first video ever actually, that there's one amongst the Valar who is a bit of an odd one out. He's the only male Valar not to take a wife, and he's the only one full stop not to dwell in Valinor. And his name is of course Ulmo, the Lord of Waters. Now, most of Ulmo's time is spent at the bottom of the Ekikaya, the outer ocean, and that's because the seas are his primary domain. But as the Lord of Waters, Ulmo's power also flows through lakes and springs and, of course, rivers, just like the Sirion. And just a fun side note, this is why the forces of darkness never really gain any kind of naval supremacy. The ocean is always a place that orcs fear to go, and even in later ages, watery places like the Grey Havens or Numenor are never assailed by orcs. I feel like this has something to do, maybe, with Ulmo. Anyway, the reason why Ulmo is such an exceptional Valar is that he interprets Manwë's decree much more loosely than any of the others. That's not to say Ulmo ever leads an army of elves into battle or anything like that, but on more than one occasion he does actively help out the good guys with warnings and with sound advice. And this is the first time that we're going to see that. So, after laying a deep sleep upon Finrod and Turgon, Ulmo speaks to them both in a dream, or separate dreams, I guess, as it's worth noting that both Turgon and Finrod believe that they are the only one to receive his message. And there's one little piece of speculation that I'll just throw out there, because although I know I said Ulmo is the only one of the Valar to actively help out the elves in the First Age, at least before the final showdown, it's possible that Ulmo may have got a bit of help from one of his friends, because although Ulmo communicates via sleep and dreams are not his thing. Water is his thing. Sleep and dreams are the domain of the Valar Irimo. So, although Tolkien never says it, we can perhaps speculate that Irimo was also at least partially involved in the delivery of Ulmo's message. Anyway, while Finrod sleeps, he is instructed to prepare for a day of evil and establish a retreat that'll be a safe haven should Morgoth ever try to break the siege of Angband. And this is the divine impetus for Finrod's founding of Nargothrond. However, although Ulmo may have provided the motivation for this new realm, the inspiration came from Eleuthingol's capital of Menegroth. So, at some point after having Ulmo's dream, we don't know when exactly, Finrod journeys back to Doriath, and he spends more time in Menegroth with his sister Galadriel. And it's while he is here that Finrod is filled with wonder at the strength and majesty of the secret underground elven city. And basically, he decides he's going to found his own version. So, Finrod opens his heart to his great-uncle Thingol and tells him all about his dream and all about Ulmo's warning. And Thingol, being the wise king that he is, points Finrod in the direction of a deep gorge cut by a river called the Narog in the west of Beleriand. And there, Finrod finds a series of caverns that have been delved into the steep slopes of the river's western shore. Now, if you recall from an earlier video, although Menegroth is an elven city inhabited by dark elves and ruled by a high elf, the city itself was, to a very significant extent, built by the skill and labour of the dwarves of Beleriand, who I promise I will talk about in the next video. Menegroth is a great example of just how awesome a place can be when elves and dwarves work together in harmony. Also, having a Maya queen overseeing the construction did probably help. And so, just as Thingol did with Menegroth, Finrod allies himself with the dwarves of the Blue Mountains to help him delve his new underground realm of Nargothrond, which, if you look at a map, is a hell of a commute for the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. However, unlike Menegroth, Nargothrond was not built out of nothing. You see, these caverns above the Narog, they did not form naturally. Way back, before any of the Noldor even left Valinor, a group of lesser dwarves, known as petty dwarves, dug these caves and built subterranean halls that in their language they called Nulukasdeen. Now, by the time Finrod arrives in these caves, the petty dwarves are all gone. But Finrod repurposed these empty caverns, and with a lot of help from the Blue Mountain dwarves, he eventually founded one of the loveliest elven realms in Beleriand. Nargothrond, a place of secrecy and peace. Now, just before I move on, the dwarves of Beleriand did not help Finrod build Nargothrond for free. We're told that Finrod had brought more treasures out of Tirion than any other of the princes of the Noldor, and so the dwarves were rewarded well for their labour. Now, Tolkien doesn't really specify much about the Noldorine treasures brought to Middle-earth by Finrod, and so we can only really speculate on their nature, with one single exception. Later in the story, we learn that one of Finrod's treasures that he brought all the way from Valinor is an emerald and silver ring that will later become famously known as the Ring of Barahir. And I won't explain its importance right now, but this ring is going to have a very, very long story. In fact, this is the exact same ring that we see Aragorn wearing 7,000 years later in The Lord of the Rings. Well, actually, he only wears it in the movies. In the books, he gives it to Arwen 38 years earlier. But still, by the time of The Lord of the Rings, this is probably the oldest piece of jewellery in all of Middle-earth. It is thousands of years older than the Rings of Power, including the One Ring. And it goes on this crazy awesome journey before ending up on Aragorn's and eventually Arwen's finger. But way back in the beginning, this ring was a treasure brought by Finrod. And just like literally everyone else, the dwarves absolutely loved Finrod. We often think of elves and dwarves as having a rocky relationship, but at this point in the story, that's simply not the case. In fact, in addition to delving the great halls of Nargothrond, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains also fashioned for Finrod an amazing necklace that's later known as the Nauglamir. Now, I won't go into too much detail on that either, as it won't become particularly relevant for a little while yet, but I do want to take a moment just to stress how incredible this necklace is. So the word that Tolkien actually uses is carcanet, and Google Images tells me that a carcanet is an incredibly big old fancy piece of jewellery. The dwarves fashion it from gold and decorate it with gems uncounted from Valinor. So, once again, this necklace represents the best of dwarves and elves working together. And despite the size of the Nauglamir, Tolkien tells us that it rested lightly on its wearer as a strand of flax, so as light as linen. And whatsoever neck it clasped, it sat always with grace and loveliness. So keep that in the back of your mind. Among the many treasures within Nargothrond, there is a particularly exquisite necklace called the Nauglamir. It's crafted by the skill of the dwarves using the gems of the Noldor. One day, that's going to be important. Anyway, just before I move on, there is one more thing that the dwarves give to Finrod, and in some ways it's even more precious than jewellery. You see, the dwarves speak their own language called Khuzdoul, but they are very, very, very protective of it, and they seldom use it around non-dwarves. It's a very intimate part of the insular dwarven culture, but the dwarves do bestow upon Finrod a name in their language, which means the hewer of caves. In Khuzdoul, this is given as Felak Gundu, but because Finrod is an elf, the name is Sindarinized into Felagund. And so, throughout the rest of the story, Finrod is known as Finrod Felagund, a friend to the dwarves and the hewer of caves. And I think this is really significant because A, dwarves very rarely share their Khuzdoul language with non-dwarven beings, but also because B, in a few videos' time, we're going to see that Finrod Felagund, a Noldorin elf with a Tellarine mother, a Vanurin grandmother, a Sindarin great-uncle, and a dwarven name, is also going to become an intensely important figure in the early history of the race of men. Finrod Felagund truly is an elven lord like no other. Now, honestly, when I first started thinking about this video, I reckoned it would be a relatively short one. I guess that's not the case. But just before I finish, I did mention at the beginning that I would circle back before the very end to Finrod's cousin, Turgon. So let's take a fairly quick look at what Prince Turgon has been getting up to since the last time we saw him. So, just like Finrod, Turgon was also visited in a dream by Ulmo, and he was also told to go and build a secret elven haven somewhere in Beleriand. And although Finrod did tick all the boxes of secret when he founded Nargothrond, Turgon takes things a few steps further. So I mentioned at the beginning that Turgon's first city was called Vinyamar, on the shores of the Western Sea. But I also mentioned that before too long, Vinyamar was completely abandoned. And this is because a year after receiving the dream, Turgon is actually visited in person by Ulmo himself. And Ulmo instructs Turgon to journey away completely alone into the encircling mountains, which can be found right here. And there he discovers a hidden valley called Tumladen. Now, Tumladen is obviously completely encircled by the encircling mountains, and so the only living beings in all of Beleriand, apart from Turgon, who know of Tumladen's existence are the great eagles who built their eyries amongst the hidden stone. So, Turgon eventually returns to Vinyamar, but he doesn't stay for long. We're told that he began in his secret councils to devise the plan of a city, and this city will go on to be called Gondolin. Now, even if you've never picked up the Silmarillion before, I reckon most of you are at least familiar with that word, Gondolin. It's actually mentioned in The Hobbit as the place where the swords Glamdring and Orcrist were originally forged. In fact, we're even told in The Hobbit that Gandalf's sword, Glamdring, was once wielded by the King of Gondolin. And although there's no way you could know it by just reading The Hobbit, that king is in fact Turgon. Anyway, Gondolin is an immensely important part of the First Age, but because it's so secret, its story is actually pretty self-contained, and I plan to do a whole series of videos dedicated entirely to Gondolin, but for now I'll leave it alone. Because, from the perspective of everyone else in Beleriand, there's nothing to say about it. Turgon simply disappears with the people of Vinyamar, and he leads them up into the mountains where they aren't seen again for hundreds of years. Even Fingon and Fingolfin don't know exactly where Turgon's disappeared to. All they hear are rumours of a hidden city, somewhere in the mountains. And guys, I know I've spent a lot of time in this series talking all about the elves, and hey, there is a lot to say about them, but in the next video I'm going to focus on the mysterious race of dwarves. Where did they come from? Who was the first one? And how did they find their way into Beleriand? So be sure to hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss it, and give this video a like and a comment if you enjoyed it. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer mellyn.